Rain pounded against the pavement, turning the empty streets into glistening rivers of water. The streetlights flickered, their glow barely cutting through the darkness. The air was cold, carrying the distant rumble of thunder as storm clouds loomed overhead. Mark pulled the hood of his jacket up and locked the door of his small veterinary clinic, letting out a tired sigh. It had been a long day, and all he wanted now was to go home, make a cup of coffee, and get some rest. He turned to leave, stepping onto the wet sidewalk, but then he froze. A faint sound cut through the rain, barely noticeable at first. A low, desperate whimper. Mark frowned, glancing around. The streets were empty, the only movement coming from the wind rattling loose signs and the rainwater rushing down the gutters. He adjusted his bag on his shoulder and started walking again, convinced he had imagined it. But then, there it was again, this time clearer. A weak, painful whine coming from a nearby alley. Mark hesitated. He knew that sound well. Over the years, he had treated countless injured strays, and this was the sound of an animal in pain. His instincts took over. He turned toward the alley, peering into the darkness. It was narrow and littered with debris, broken crates, discarded plastic bags, and puddles reflecting the dim streetlights. The whimper came again, slightly louder, and Mark followed the sound, his boots splashing through the shallow water. His heart pounded as he stepped deeper into the alley. The storm raged on, the wind howling between the buildings, making it harder to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. He squinted into the shadows, then saw something, a shape curled up against the cold brick wall. He took another cautious step forward, eyes narrowing. As he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a dog, a German shepherd. She was lying motionless, her soaked fur clinging to her thin frame. Even in the dim light, Mark could see she was in bad shape. A dark stain spread across her side, blood mixing with rainwater. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling unevenly. When Mark stepped closer, her golden eyes flickered open, filled with exhaustion and fear. He crouched down, speaking softly. "Hey girl, it's okay. I'm here to help." The dog barely reacted, her body too weak to move. Mark hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. He wasn't about to leave her here. Not in this storm, not like this. Carefully, he reached out, knowing that whatever had happened to her, this was just the beginning. Mark moved closer, his eyes scanning the injured dog lying motionless against the cold brick wall. The German shepherd's fur was soaked from the rain, her body shivering as she struggled to breathe. A deep wound stretched across her side, dark blood mixing with the water pooling beneath her. She looked fragile, too weak to even lift her head. But what struck Mark the most were her eyes, golden and filled with fear, yet holding on to something else. A silent plea, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. He hesitated. He had seen injured dogs before, some too far gone to save. His clinic was closed, and he was exhausted after a long shift. A dog in this condition would need serious care, and he wasn't sure if he could handle it alone. He considered calling animal rescue, but with the storm raging on, it would take too long for them to arrive. Another gust of wind howled through the alley, and the shepherd let out a soft, painful whimper, her body trembling harder. That was it. Mark couldn't leave her here. "All right, girl," he murmured, stepping closer and kneeling beside her. He reached out slowly, careful not to startle her. She didn't move, but her breathing grew quicker, as if she was bracing for pain. "I'm not going to hurt you," he promised, keeping his voice calm. Gently, he ran his hand along her side, feeling the cold, wet fur, the ribs pressing through her thin body. The wound was deep, but it wasn't fresh. She had been like this for hours, maybe longer. How had she survived this long in the rain? Had someone abandoned her? Or had she been running from something? The dog let out a soft, wheezing sigh, her body going limp. Mark's stomach clenched. She was losing strength fast. He had to act now. Carefully, he slid one arm under her chest, the other beneath her hind legs. She barely reacted as he lifted her, her head resting weakly against his arm. She was lighter than she should have been, too thin for a dog her size. As he stood, She let out a faint whimper, but there was no fight left in her. Mark held her close as he carried her out of the alley, shielding her from the heavy rain as best he could. His truck was parked just around the corner, and he moved quickly, his boots splashing through puddles. As soon as he reached the vehicle, he pulled open the passenger door and carefully placed her on the seat, wrapping his jacket around her to keep her warm. She didn't move, her breathing shallow, her body barely responding. Mark sat beside her for a moment, his heart pounding. He had no idea what had happened to her, where she had come from, or if she even had a chance of surviving. But he couldn't let her die here, alone in the cold. He reached out, brushing wet fur from her face, and whispered, "It's okay, girl. I won't let you die out here." With that, he started the truck, turning up the heat to keep her warm. As he pulled onto the road, heading straight for his clinic, he had no idea that this moment would change both of their lives forever. Mark pushed open the clinic door with his shoulder, carefully cradling the unconscious dog in his arms. The warmth inside was a sharp contrast to the freezing rain outside, but the German Shepherd didn't react. Her body remained limp, her breathing shallow. Moving quickly, he carried her to the examination table, grabbing a clean towel to dry her soaked fur. As he worked, his hands brushed over old scars hidden beneath her coat, thin, faded lines running along her legs and back. She had been hurt before, more than once. This wasn't just a stray fighting to survive. Someone had put her through this. His eyes fell on the worn collar around her neck. It was old, the leather cracked, the metal buckle rusted. There was no tag, no name, no phone number, no sign of who she belonged to. Had she been abandoned? Or had she escaped from something worse? Mark exhaled, pushing his thoughts aside. Right now, the only thing that mattered was keeping her alive. He grabbed his medical kit and got to work. The wound on her side was deep, but not fresh. It had stopped bleeding, but infection had already set in. He carefully cleaned the area, applying antiseptic before wrapping it in fresh bandages. Every movement was slow, gentle. He didn't want to startle her if she woke up. Once her wound was tended to, he checked for any broken bones. Her ribs were too easy to feel beneath her thin coat, her body malnourished from days, maybe weeks, of struggling to survive. He prepared in four, slipping the needle into her leg to get fluids into her system. She let out a faint whimper, but didn't wake. Mark sat beside her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. He had treated hundreds of injured animals, but something about this dog felt different. There was a story hidden in her scars, in the fear still lingering on her face, even in unconsciousness. He glanced at the clock. It was going to be a long night. Instead of going home, he pulled a chair closer to the table, resting his arms on the edge. The storm continued to rage outside, the sound of rain tapping against the windows. The dog barely moved, but her breathing was steady now, stronger than before. Mark stayed with her, his eyes never leaving her fragile form. He didn't know where she had come from or what she had been through. But one thing was certain, she wasn't alone anymore. The first light of morning filtered through the clinic windows, casting a soft glow over the room. Mark shifted in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He had stayed by the German Shepherd's side all night, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. She hadn't moved much, but at least she was alive. He reached for his coffee, now cold, when he noticed a slight movement. The dog stirred, her body tensing as she let out a faint whimper. Mark set his cup down and leaned in. "Hey, girl," he said gently. Her ears twitched, and for the first time, her golden eyes flickered open. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the light, but the moment she saw him, her body stiffened. She tried to move, but her muscles were weak, her legs barely responding. Mark could see the panic rising in her eyes, the way her breathing quickened as if she expected something bad to happen. "Easy," he murmured, keeping his voice calm. He reached out, moving slowly, but the moment his hand got too close, she flinched. A sharp, instinctive reaction. Mark froze, pulling his hand back. The fear in her eyes wasn't just from pain. It was something deeper. This wasn't just a dog that had been lost or abandoned. She had been through something bad. He gave her space, letting her adjust. She was awake, but exhaustion still weighed heavy on her. She lay there, watching him with wary eyes, her body tense but unmoving. He stayed quiet, letting her take in her surroundings. After a while, she let out a deep breath, her muscles relaxing slightly, though the fear never left her face. Mark stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said softly. She didn't react, but he wasn't expecting her to. He grabbed a small bowl, filled it with water, and placed it in front of her. She didn't move at first, her eyes flicking between him and the bowl. Then, cautiously, she stretched her neck forward and lapped at the water, her movements slow and careful. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the rest of the morning, Mark kept his distance, giving her time to adjust. She never took her eyes off him. Every move he made, every step he took, she watched tense and alert. But something about the way she followed his movements gave him an idea. "Shadow," he murmured, testing the name. It suited her. She was quiet, always lingering in the background, watching everything but never fully present. "What do you think, girl?" "Shadow." She didn't react, but that was okay. She would get used to it. Over the next few hours, Shadow grew a little stronger. She still struggled to stand, but she managed to shift her body, stretching her legs slowly. Mark brought her some food, soft, easy to eat, but she barely touched it. He didn't push her. He knew trust wasn't something that happened overnight. By the afternoon, she had managed to sit up on her own. It was shaky, unsteady, but it was progress. Mark sat across from her, arms resting on his knees. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he said, though he wasn't sure if she believed him. She studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Not just fear, something deeper, something broken. "What have you been through, girl?" he whispered. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Her scars, her reaction to his touch, the way she watched him like she was waiting for the worst, it told him everything he needed to know. She had survived something terrible. Mark knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her go back to that life. Whatever had happened before, whoever had hurt her, it was over now. She was safe. For the first time, she lowered her head slightly, resting her chin on her paws. A small, hesitant movement, but it was enough. A sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe she was safe too. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. The clinic was dimly lit, only the soft glow of the lamp near Mark's chair casting long shadows across the room. He had been reading, half distracted, when a low, rumbling growl made him freeze. He looked up. Shadow was stiff, her ears pricked forward, her golden eyes locked onto the window. Her body was tense, muscles coiled as if preparing for something unseen. Mark frowned, setting his book down. "What is it, girl?" he asked, but she didn't take her eyes off the window. He followed her gaze, his pulse quickening as he stood up. At first, he saw nothing but the reflection of the room in the glass. But then a movement, a shadow, just beyond the streetlight, standing still in the darkness. A person. Mark's stomach clenched. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't walking by like a passerby. They were just standing there, watching. The moment he shifted closer to the window, the figure stepped back, swallowed by the darkness. Within seconds, they were gone. Mark exhaled, pressing a hand against the cool glass. His eyes scanned the street, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No sound, no footsteps fading into the night. Just emptiness. Shadow let out another growl, quieter this time, but still on edge. Her body remained rigid, tail low, ears twitching at every small noise. Mark turned toward her, running a hand over his face. "It's all right," he said, though the words felt hollow. She didn't relax. She stayed near the window, her body blocking the view, her breathing slow but heavy. Mark glanced outside once more before pulling the curtain shut. He didn't know who that was, but whoever it was, they had been watching. The unease settled deep in his chest, a heavy weight that wouldn't lift. He turned back to Shadow, crouching beside her. "It's okay," he murmured, but she only flicked her ears, still staring at the covered window. She wasn't convinced. Neither was he. For the rest of the night, Shadow was restless. She paced near the door, pausing every few minutes to sniff the air. Her ears stayed up, her body coiled like she was waiting for something. Watching her, Mark felt the same thought creep into his mind, over and over again. Who was looking for her? And more importantly, why? The next morning, Mark made a decision. The figure outside his clinic, the way Shadow had reacted, it wasn't normal. Someone was looking for her, and he needed to know why. He grabbed his keys and whistled for Shadow. She hesitated for a moment, but followed him to the truck. Her body was still tense, her ears twitching at every small sound. Mark could feel it too, that lingering unease that hadn't left since last night. The drive to the police station was quiet. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her golden eyes scanning everything as if expecting danger. When they arrived, Mark led her inside, stopping at the front desk. An officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, glanced up from his paperwork. "Need some help?" the officer asked. "Yeah," Mark said. "I found this dog a few days ago. She doesn't have a tag, but I was hoping you could scan her for a microchip." The officer nodded and led them to a small room. Mark kept a hand on Shadow's back as the officer pulled out a handheld scanner. The moment it beeped, the man's expression changed. His eyes flicked to Mark, then back to the screen. He frowned, his fingers tightening around the scanner. "What is it?" Mark asked, his stomach twisting. The officer hesitated before turning the screen toward him. Mark leaned in, his breath catching as he read the words on the display. Shadow wasn't just any dog. She was registered as a military K9, part of an elite search and rescue unit trained for high-risk missions. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Her unit had been reported dead. 6 months ago. Mark stared at the screen, his mind racing. Shadow wasn't just a stray. She had been part of something much bigger. The officer tapped a few keys, pulling up more information. K9 Unit 7 Delta. Search and rescue. Trained for high-risk missions. Deployed overseas. But then, the last entry, the one that made Mark's blood run cold. Unit lost in ambush. No reported survivors. He glanced at Shadow, who sat quietly beside him, unaware of the storm her past had just unleashed. How had she survived when her entire team hadn't? And if she had made it out, did someone know she was still alive? The thought sent a chill down Mark's spine. She wasn't supposed to make it back, the officer muttered, shaking his head. If she escaped, someone's probably looking for her. Mark clenched his fists. That explained the figure outside his clinic, the uneasy feeling Shadow had since the night she arrived. Someone out there knew the truth, and they weren't just looking for answers. They wanted to erase them. As they left the station, Mark couldn't shake the weight of what he had learned. Shadow was trained for war, built for dangerous missions most wouldn't survive. But she wasn't just physically strong, she was a fighter. Whatever had happened in that ambush, she had made it through. She had survived, and now someone wanted to make sure she didn't. The drive home was quiet. Mark's mind replayed every moment he had spent with Shadow. The way she reacted to sudden noises, how she flinched at loud bangs, the way she froze when the helicopter passed overhead a few nights ago. It all made sense now. She wasn't just scared, she was remembering. The gunfire, the explosions, the chaos of that mission gone wrong. Whoever had owned her before, whoever had trained her, had left her behind. Maybe they thought she was dead. Maybe they had wanted her dead. But now, she had resurfaced, and Mark had a sinking feeling that whoever had been watching the clinic last night wasn't finished. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, glancing at Shadow. She sat still, ears alert, eyes scanning the road ahead. She could feel it too, the danger. Mark wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was certain. Shadow's past wasn't behind her. And now, it was coming for both of them. The night was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Mark sat at the table, staring at the files he had printed about Shadow's past, but his mind wasn't on the words. His gut told him something was wrong. The uneasy feeling from earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Then, a low growl cut through the silence. Mark's head snapped up. Shadow was by the window, her body tense, ears pricked forward. The sound wasn't a warning. It was a threat. She wasn't just sensing something. She knew something was there. Mark stood slowly, his heart pounding. He moved to the window, careful not to make any sudden noise. The outside was dark, only faintly illuminated by the dim porch light. He scanned the yard, his breath steady but his pulse racing. Then he saw them. Footprints. Fresh, deep prints in the muddy ground just beyond the porch. The rain from earlier had softened the earth, making the tracks stand out clearly. Someone had been there. Recently. Mark's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the tree line at the edge of his property, searching for movement. Nothing. Whoever had been there was gone. But for how long? Had they just been watching? Or were they planning something worse? Shadow's growl didn't stop. Her body stayed rigid, eyes locked on the footprints as if expecting their owner to return. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. Someone knew about her. Someone was looking for her. And now, they weren't just watching from a distance. They were getting closer. The night had barely settled when the sound of shattering glass tore through the silence. Mark jumped to his feet, his instincts kicking in before his mind could catch up. Shadow was already ahead of him, her growl turning into a vicious snarl. The broken window in the living room sent cold air rushing inside, and through the dim light, Mark saw a dark figure climbing through the frame. Before he could even reach for his gun, Shadow moved. She lunged, her body a blur of muscle and fury. The intruder barely had time to react before she was on him, knocking him back against the window frame with a force that sent them both crashing to the floor. A muffled yell escaped the masked man as Shadow's teeth snapped inches from his throat. Mark grabbed his gun, his hand steady despite the chaos unfolding in front of him. The intruder fought back, struggling to throw Shadow off, but she was relentless. Every time he shoved, she came back harder, her jaws clamping onto his sleeve, dragging him back down before he could reach for anything. Mark didn't hesitate. In 2 quick steps, he closed the distance, slamming the butt of his gun against the intruder's arm, sending whatever he was reaching for skidding across the floor. Shadow pinned him, her growl deep, dangerous, a warning that she wasn't letting go. Mark grabbed the intruder by the collar, ripping the mask from his face. His breath caught. Who was this guy? And more importantly, why was he here? Mark didn't wait for answers. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police, his grip on the gun firm as Shadow stood guard, teeth bared, not taking her eyes off the man who had just tried to force his way into their lives. This content may violate our usage policies. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Mark stepped back as 2 officers hauled the intruder to his feet, his hands now cuffed behind his back. Shadow didn't move. She stood firm, her golden eyes locked onto the man, her body still tense, ready to attack if he so much as twitched. One of the officers pulled Mark aside, his expression grim. "We ran his ID," he said. "Name's Daniel Reeves. Former military. Dishonorably discharged." Mark's grip tightened. He knew Shadow. The officer nodded. Not just knew her, he trained her. He was her original handler before he was kicked out of the program. Turns out, after leaving the military, he got involved in some ugly things. Illegal dogfights, underground training rings. That's why he wanted her back. Mark's stomach twisted. He looked at Shadow, the scars beneath her fur, the way she had flinched at sudden movements when he first found her. She hadn't just escaped an ambush, she had escaped him. The officer continued. "We don't have all the details yet, but from what we can tell, Shadow wasn't lost in action. She ran. She got away from whatever hell he put her through. And now, he wanted to make sure she didn't stay free." Mark glanced at the man, now slumped against the squad car, his eyes cold, his jaw clenched. "Not anymore," Mark said quietly. Reeves lifted his head, locking eyes with Shadow. For the first time that night, there was no arrogance, no anger, just fear. Because he knew. She wasn't his anymore. Shadow had defeated him. The next morning, Mark sat on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, his mind heavy with the decision he had to make. Shadow lay beside him, her head resting on her paws, her golden eyes watching the sunrise. The police had taken Reeves away, and with him, the last piece of Shadow's past that had haunted her. But now, there was another question. What came next? The military knew she was alive. They would want her back. Dogs like her, trained for elite search and rescue missions, were rare. They would see her as an asset, a soldier who needed to return to duty. But as Mark looked down at her, he knew she wasn't just a tool to be sent back into danger. She was more than that. Shadow had fought enough. He reached out, running a hand gently over her fur. She didn't flinch anymore. She had learned to trust him, just as he had learned to trust her. "You're home now, Shadow," he murmured. Her tail thumped against the wood, slow and steady, a quiet acknowledgement of what she had probably known all along. Mark made it official that afternoon. The adoption papers were signed, sealing what his heart had already decided. Shadow wasn't going anywhere. She was his now, and he was hers. But her journey didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, Mark saw something change in her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was healing. The haunted look in her eyes faded, replaced by quiet confidence. She followed Mark everywhere, but not out of fear. It was loyalty, a bond that neither of them had expected but had come to depend on. Then one day, something happened that made everything clear. A veteran had come into Mark's clinic, an old friend who had served with him. The man sat stiffly, his hands shaking slightly, his breaths uneven. Shadow, without hesitation, walked up to him and pressed her head into his lap. Mark watched as his friend exhaled, his body relaxing for the first time since he had walked through the door. That's when Mark knew. Shadow had been trained to save lives, and that's exactly what she would do. But not on a battlefield, not in war. She would do it here in a way that mattered just as much. She became a service dog, working with veterans who carried wounds no one could see. She understood their pain because she had lived it. Her trauma became her strength, a bridge between past suffering and new hope. And in the process of healing others, she finally healed herself. The sky burned with shades of orange and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. Mark sat on the porch, his fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, though he wasn't really drinking it. His gaze rested on the open land ahead, but his mind was elsewhere. Beside him, Shadow stretched out, her body relaxed in a way he had never seen before. No tension, no fear, just peace. She let out a slow breath, her ears twitching slightly as she watched the world settle into evening. Mark set his cup down and reached out, running his hand gently over her fur. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she nudged his palm with her nose, a soft, deliberate motion. Then, for the first time since he had found her in that alley, her tail wagged. Slow, steady, full of trust. Mark felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent so long thinking he was the one saving her, but now he realized the truth. "We saved each other, girl," he murmured. Shadow let out a quiet sigh and leaned against him, her golden eyes half closed, content. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt whole. Shadow's journey had been one of survival, strength, and second chances. She had once been an abandoned dog, left to suffer alone in the cold, her body weak, her spirit nearly broken. She had fought through pain, escaped a cruel past, and found her way to someone who saw more in her than just a wounded stray. From that night in the alley to the moment she defended Mark's home, she had proven she was more than just a survivor. She was a fighter, a protector, a hero. But most of all, she was family. She wasn't just a dog who had been saved. She had saved Mark, too, in ways neither of them had expected. Shadow had found where she truly belonged, not as a soldier, not as a tool for someone else's gain, but as a companion, a guardian, and a light in the lives of those who needed her. Her past had been painful, but it didn't define her. She had turned her pain into purpose, helping others heal, just as she had healed herself. There are so many dogs like Shadow, abandoned, forgotten, waiting for someone to give them a chance. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder that rescue dogs aren't broken. They're just waiting for the right person to believe in them. Consider adopting, fostering, or supporting a rescue shelter. A second chance can change everything. Subscribe, like, and share to spread awareness. Together, we can make sure every dog gets the home, love, and safety they deserve. Because sometimes saving them means saving a part of ourselves, too.